Thank you very much, Henriette. Thank you very much. Ernest was also a co-investigator on the project at the Glasgow end, and thanks very much to Jenny for her truly outstanding responsibility for a social media offensive that dwarfs most of those that are used to advertise papers, seminars and lectures. So thank you all for that. It's very good to be here, and I feel that we've travelled a very long way in very different ways in the last year or two. And I'm going to start by harking back to a speech I heard, a wise and thoughtful speech actually I heard about 16 months ago, and a couple of colleagues in the room were actually there. And that was when, in October 2013, Pat Kane made a speech at the University of Mainz in Germersheim, in which he noted that the last year of the referendum campaign would largely be fought out in social media, and that it would be the strength of social media at this juncture in history which would determine whether or not such a strategy was successful. He was signalling, to cite Malcolm Gladwell, a tipping point between the influence of social and the legacy of mainstream media in shaping opinion and driving the communication of that opinion. A tipping point which has arguably been coming closer and closer over the years, at least among the major demographics of users of social media. Even at that conference, which was on Scotland 2014, Coming of Age, Loss of Innocence, the process of such change and its speed was manifest. Some wanted to contribute to the public debate over the referendum with a book, which symbolically speaking is just out, 6 months too late, and is therefore of immediate historical interest. Others, as has been done since, would have preferred a setting of the major questions, not like that, in more contemporary media. As the author of many books, including some of those which have engaged with the debate, I can say without a concomitant media, social media and public appearances strategy, books are highly unlikely to have an immediate impact on any debate. And such a strategy, of course, has its price. It drives the author's presentation towards the strong and simple narratives that we find easiest to remember and which deceive us most. And there we have. I'm not sure what hubby's bad breath kills his wife and the vow have in common, but I only need to take perhaps a minute to think of an answer. But they're going back a series of relatively modern headlines going back to the infamous 1996 Daily Mirror Achtung Surrender European Championship headline. You wonder where UKIP votes come from. Now you know. The newspaper headline is, of course, a rhetorical device. It is suasive, but it is crude, and it is there to meet the needs of the moment, as is all rhetoric. And essentially the needs of the moment are very much, the sale needs of the moment are there very much in the headline. Now newspapers, here's some more needs of the moment. And I think that's very nicely expressed. I had to share this one, even though it comes from shall we say, a source with a particular view of the debate, because it is a very nice comparison of Deutsche Bank's advice on the 13th of September and Deutsche Bank's analysis on the 9th of February. It all depends. Deutsche Bank has, of course, in this matter, complete integrity, and a lot has changed in the last 5 months. Clearly, it's not really a question of a conversion on the way to Damascus. It's more a question that 5 days before any outcome, such as that of the 18th September referendum, there is no way that the Telegraph would have run the story in any other way at all. Now, newspapers rely very heavily on valency to persuade, and this is valency. Introducing a concept up on the current slide. Valency ultimately has its roots in classical rhetorical theory, the good orator as the good man, orators being sadly mostly men in those days. But it has its afterlife in modern rhetorical theory, particularly in marketing. And the core issue of valency is, who do you trust to give you a message? Who is the authority? So I mean, this valency is always up for debate, but a suggested scale of valency on a plus to minus 10 scale, quite often used in certain marketing approaches, is plus 10 is your mother, right? Okay, you trust your mother, but you probably don't trust your mother advising on tablet purchase and social media strategy, so the natural valency would fall somewhat there. The right toothpaste, yes. The right social media strategy, probably slight diminution in credibility. A child you know is probably plus 7. That's why politicians have photos with babies. It helps, though you don't know the baby, it helps to rub off the positive innocence, the positive innocent valency of a child. Celebrity usually has a positive valency. Beauty raises the level of valency for celebrity, and so does humour, and so sometimes, depending how you interpret it, does virtue. Somebody of known integrity, you know, like previous foreign secretaries. Of somewhat low, I think, positive valence, and I'll come to that, is the BBC. Doctors of positive valency, probably falling in recent years. A lot of online health advice and so forth. A lot of challenges from a more informed public to doctors, but still a very, I think, a positive valency. The BBC, that's an interesting one. I think one of the things, and I'll come back to this, that made Yes campaigners so angry in their campaign is that actually the level of trust that the BBC enjoys is, although not in Scotland, where the most recent polling evidence that I've seen shows that only 53% of those resident in Scotland think of the BBC as an institution that speaks for the whole of the UK, as opposed to 96% being happy to see the NHS as a UK-wide institution. 53% of the BBC. The BBC enjoys much higher levels of trust elsewhere in the UK, and it's the frustration with the belief that higher levels of trust are being taken advantage of, which I think drove a lot of the anger. But certainly I think the BBC does have positive valency. I'm going to come on to UKIP, not for very long, but I am going to come on to UKIP because I think one of the very interesting things to go beyond the referendum campaign to look at current rhetorical issues is that the BBC are the first to suggest that UKIP join the prime ministerial debates, I think. And I think there's a widespread view that the BBC's reporting of UKIP is actually fairly kid gloves. That's an issue. You may disagree with it. I'm not sure if I have seen in a wide enough range of things to agree with it, but that actually there is a default positive valency going on around UKIP because a lot of the really tough questions have not been asked, and I'll come back to that when we talk about social media strategy. And how social media strategy is often used to get beyond the kind of questions that aren't being asked by the media. And I think they'll go to it, maybe not now, but if you must, hashtag Ask Nigel Farage, you'll see, if you haven't already seen, the huge range of questions on Twitter which create a virtual environment in which Nigel Farage can be questioned. He won't answer, of course, unlike Nicola Sturgeon, he won't actually give you any answers because he didn't actually want this Q&A. But actually, the Ask Nigel Farage hashtag is illustrative of a lack of serious questioning which has been offered to UKIP, arguably by the mainstream media. Or some contradictory, I put down as 0 or +1 that, for example, the wide range of contradictory recommendations about diet and alcohol from professional bodies tends to end up with a tension which, of positive and negative belief, which really tends to cancel each other out. And obviously the negative valency needs no real glossing. And that's politicians, print journalists, senior UK bankers, estate agents and second-hand car salesmen, fall right down towards the nadir of Liberal Democrat UK general election 2010 tuition fee policy. But anyway, you get the basic point. We can argue about the details. Valencing is about the credibility of who's speaking to you. Now, newspapers have historically relied very heavily on valency to persuade. And this valency itself depends on two things: the association with high valency individuals or organisations, the Times is the historic master of that, and a different market, the Guardian, and mass circulation, valency through weight, the Record historically and the Sunday Post, again historically, acquire high valency through the weight of circulation. But here, for example, is a classic treatment of the Times. For much more than a century, the Times has been an integral and important part of the political structure of Great Britain. Its news and its editorial comment have in general been carefully coordinated and have at most times been handled with an earnest sense of responsibility. While the paper has omitted some trivia to its columns, its whole emphasis has been on important public affairs, treated with an eye to the best interests of Britain. To guide this treatment, the editors have for long periods been in close touch with 10 Downing Street. Well, that might be a little bit more questionable even for a mass audience than now than it was in 1959. But if you look at this is how commentators build valency and acknowledge it. The Times' integral quality to the establishment, going back to its presence as the Thunderer in the novels of Trollope and beyond, is very clear-cut and a very inherited position. But here Nevin's view of it builds this up even further. Although the paper's omitted some trivia to its columns, presumably the person trying to get into the Times by saying he's seen the first cuckoo in Western Subbage, his whole emphasis has been on important public affairs and what's in the best interest of Britain, and that means being close to 10 Downing Street. So that actually the fact is that its presence as a state voice is quite openly acknowledged in this statement. And as such, however, it is intended to build up the notion of its authority and its valency. And now, with an inerring sense of time, and Philip Schlesinger just having entered the lecture theatre, I'm going to put my foot straight in an elephant trap by talking about the situation that print and electronic media have got themselves into very briefly over the last 40 years, which you thought know so much better than I do. Now, just to sum up, because I've got to make this the move towards the different valencing and the different uses of media, with the spread of the electronic media and the migrancy of news into different and more immediate contexts, newspapers expanded commentary. As competing commentary grew in the electronic media, the circulation of newspapers eased. As the web expanded into social media, newspaper sales slid rapidly, and the industry as a whole is still struggling with paywall content models. As the competition for circulation became more cutthroat, the newspaper headline intensified its tendency to stark overstatement. The Sun mastered this in the 1980s in its drive towards a dominant UK-wide tabloid market position, with headlines such as "Gotcha," of course, on the sinking of the Belgrano. But all the time, the valency of print depended on a diluting circulation and increasingly a diluting social status. I think that there's certainly a case that the more and more exaggerated and strong headlines that we saw earlier have themselves had a part to play long term in eroding the valency, the authority of print culture. Newspapers' use of politicians, businessmen and celebrities to restore rhetorical valency has had some, but I think, mixed results. And yet, the lights are certainly not low here, and so no one will be surprised that I remember the referendum in 1979. Albeit, what was on offer was a hesitant, ill-thought-out and compromised devolutionary settlement, horse-traded to nonsense by the Westminster parties, and so in that case, entirely different from what we can expect later this year. There was, for much of those who remember that campaign, to remind us of more recent times. We have the vow, "No vote will not kill devolution," pledges Thatcher. We have much after the event, Healy admits oil tax cover-up. We have an intervention by Gordon Brown 10 days before polling day, February the 19th, 1979. He didn't actually seem to promise anything, but he just wanted to be in the paper, I think. We have the yes vote stressing positivity, and the no vote stressing conflict, indecision, extra taxation, loss of power and influence, and breakup of Britain. So not a million miles away from where we got to. more recently. Tabloid claims that devolution would herald the closure of uncompetitive plants like Linwood and Ravenscraig, made I think by the Daily Mail, were treated as if they're either true or real possibilities, whereas 10 vital questions you want answered in the Herald presented the advocates of change as required to provide certainty, while those who doubted it could present assertion unmediated by interrogation. Even the questions themselves were constructed on the "when did you stop beating your wife" principle. What would the Assembly cost Scotland? Would an Assembly mean a great deal more civil servants? If an Assembly is set up, would not Scotland's influence at Westminster be diminished? Is the Assembly not the first step to complete breakup of the United Kingdom? That's the triumph of hope, isn't it? Writ large. See how the questions are constructed, and of course they're being put publicly in a newspaper. They're not actually being put, around a smoke-filled room as it was in those days to the Yes campaign. They're being put by a newspaper. They're publicly stated questions designed to suggest to you that there are serious issues to be answered, rather than that there are any positivities to take out of the campaign. The idea that the Yes campaign had questions to answer, and it was their job to answer them precisely, accurately, and comprehensively with respect to what would happen in the future, was one of the classical rhetorical strategies of the 1979 campaign, fruitfully revisited 35 years later. It was a brilliant extension of anti-occupatio. Now, anti-occupatio, and as we've already heard from Henriette, the origin is in Cicero and Quintilian, though I think there are some variant readings as to whether it actually does say what it does say that in Cicero's text. However, that's the way it's become used historically as that term, is the anticipation of an opponent's objections. She will say that that is not so because, counter-argument, and data, logical proof, valency, trust me, don't trust her or him, they're no good. Inconsistency, they have said, but at other times they've said, demonstrates that they won't be able to make a positive case. And at preferably that stage you can invoke authority outside the immediate debate who cannot be refuted. That would be an ideal version of anti-occupatio. So what it basically does is it prevents the opponent occupying the ground that you think the opponent would like to occupy. It puts them in a corner before they actually make their case. It prevents them from making the case they want to make, and it presumes that and tries to ensure that you've answered the case. Now I'm going to use some examples for this. Is anti-occupatio one of the most effective of all rhetorical strategies? Because the surest way to anticipate the ground an opponent will occupy is to remove that ground from occupation by occupying it yourself. And there are various ways to do this. The non sequitur, usually by hint or suggestion, suggesting that the opponent's going to say something which they're bound to say, and suggesting that something quite dreadful will follow from it, which it isn't bound to at all. A good example of this was the persistent hint that persistent claim, which indeed turned out to be true, that oil prices would fall, which of course they have. But that was always associated with Scotland gaining control of its oil. As we're now seeing, one of the interesting things was that the consequences, there was a zero consequence for UK budgetary tax policy on the basis that oil prices are going to fall. So one of the interesting things about that rhetorical construction was that oil couldn't be used as an argument for independence because oil prices are going to fall. Oil prices are going to fall, and of course they have fallen, therefore the Scottish economy will be shot to bits. We know oil prices are going to fall. However, we're not going to change our tax revenue to encourage the North Sea industry, even though there's a relatively high benchmark of extraction costs in the North Sea. So that oil prices, so that actually, although it turns out to be right, the argument that the Better Together made was to the effect that if the Scotland becomes independent, oil prices will fall, and if it doesn't, they won't. And that was a concealed non sequitur, the argument over oil prices. It was designed to give you the impression that Scotland was on a sugar peg economically with regards to the oil price, but actually not to acknowledge the falling oil price as a real geopolitical issue. It was also what some people, including some distinguished professors of my acquaintance, might describe as the curse of carbon. The curse of carbon would only apply to its national ownership and not to the current British tax regime. And so really, oil had the common sense to lower its price in the event of a yes vote. That would be the effect, which just showed that oil had more sense than a large portion of the Scottish electorate. Ultimately, if you take it to reductio ad absurdum, that's what happens. Now, another was the removal of the ground altogether. And here the classic case was the unconditional rejection of a currency union by George Osborne in early 2014, seeking to prevent the establishment of any space to negotiate what would need to be negotiated. The important thing, the great advantage held by Better Together rhetorically in terms of anti-occupatio was that if you occupy the opponent's space by claiming that you know what the outcome of any negotiation will be, then the necessary outcome of any vote, which is a negotiation, can't really exist in people's minds because there is no negotiation. So, George Osborne said, and this is not the full list, but it's enough to be going on with, in just over 7 months, people in Scotland will decide whether or not to walk away from the United Kingdom. The stakes couldn't be higher. The certain security of being part of the UK, or the uncertainty and risk of going it alone. At the very heart of this choice is the pound in your pocket. Why? Because the currency we use is about so much more than notes and coins. It's about the value of our savings, our power to purchase the everyday things we need, and how to make the wheels of trade and commerce turn. A stable currency is the bedrock of our economy. It underpins our jobs, our mortgages, our pensions, our public services and our taxes, and the opportunities for our children and our grandchildren. I don't have a vote on 18th September. Well, if you just look at how this is constructed. First of all, apart from that, it just takes away the whole ground of a debate over a currency union or any other arrangement. It attempts to say, there isn't a negotiation over this, that's it, you're not getting the pound. Of course, rhetorically, that was further than could be gone. You couldn't stop the Scottish Government or Scotland from using the pound, but nonetheless, that's the rhetorical claim here. Walk away. Walk away, what do you walk away from? Marriage, responsibilities, you name it. Those are things you walk away from. Bad thing to do to walk away. I don't do walking away. That's a positive thing, right? So, so walking away is not good. From the United Kingdom, right? So this Scotland is going to become, the United Kingdom is a perfectly normal constitutional entity. For those who think that it involves, the UK actually constitutionally involves other countries besides Scotland, I recommend they read the preamble to the Acts of Union. But nonetheless, the United Kingdom remains integrated. Scotland floats away into some nether region of ultimate darkness. The stakes couldn't be higher. You're a gambler. You're gambling before you walk away. But you're not going to walk away with any winnings. You're going to walk away and you lose everything, right? The certainty and security of being part of the UK. It's great. Okay? That's positive. And the uncertainty and risk of going it alone. Well, very simple. All the risk on one side, all the confidence on the other. At the very heart of this choice is the pound in your pocket. I don't know if that was meant to quote Harold Wilson, but I hope not. That was the famous 1967 speech, this will not affect the pound in your pocket, the devaluation from $2.80 to $2.40. Why? Because the currency used about so much more than notes and coins. And what happens at this stage is, there's a strong suggestion the pound is more than a currency. It's a kind of macroeconomic guarantee of illimitable microeconomic transactions. It's more than notes and coins. It's the sole economic reality. It is ultimately a metaphysical entity which underpins all financial instruments, transactions, and planning. What became, or should have begun as a macroeconomic debate on currency policy, has turned into the reification of notes and coins into a marvelous, superb idol, and then its transformation back to a principle of underpinning certainty. So this is absolutely classic. Where do you go from here? What is your plan B? You've no space left on plan A because Osborne has just staked it out. Classic anti-occupatio. Now a third was the use of the law and the legal position to undermine the possibility of political change, not least the position of independent Scotland in EU law. This again sought to remove space which one's opponent might occupy or argue for the occupation of. This approach went, I have to say, largely unchallenged, despite the fact that simply on basic functionality, law is the product of politics. A government that cannot pass laws is not a government, and a government that cannot change laws is not a government either. And unsurprisingly, a case for radical political change could be presented as out with the legal framework which had been constructed by the political forces anxious to prevent it happening in the first place. It was an excellent strategy, though, since law gives, particularly constitutional and some aspects of international law, so seldom challenged in court, apparently clear-cut answers. But ultimately, politics always trumps law. And for those who don't believe that, it's worth reflecting on the contemporary discussion on the legality of the attack in Iraq in 2003 and the recommendations which were legally made at that time, and of course the ever-present urgently delivered and desperately awaited Chilcot report. Well, it's of course possible that a century ago, if you remember, the head of the wartime cabinet, the award of a wartime cabinet role as Attorney General and a state funeral to Edward Carson, the founder of the UVF and a man prepared to acknowledge and utilise the running of German guns to the north of Ireland, must have been in recognition of his outstanding respect for the legal process. The Curragh mutiny of a century before Pat Kane spoke showed how little the rule of law counts in a state determined to resist constitutional change. But nonetheless, the rule of law and what the position was legally became a substitute for political negotiation. It was once again a way of occupying your opponent's space. Now, all these routes to withdraw a place to stand from the advocates of change depend on valency. They particularly depend on the trust accorded to the source, to British ministers, experts in the oil industry and the law. But in an age of growing scepticism about authority, while these figures may retain respect among traditional right-wing or older voters to some extent, they had a problem they did not suffer to the same extent in 1979, when Alec Douglas-Hume's promise of a better deal from the Tories on devolution halved the Conservative yes vote almost overnight. On the contrary, many if not most voters disbelieved Osborne on the currency question. What was needed was a fourth approach, an extension and development of a successful tactic in the 1977-79 campaign, the question. Repetition is the big weapon of electronic age rhetoric, pre-social media electronic age rhetoric. Repetition. Pioneered the big lie of the 1930s, but it too, repetition, depends on valency, and suffering from its valency's shrinkage as institutions, politicians, authorities and leaders become less and less trusted to deliver the authoritative, certain truth. So that repetition, although repetition reinforces valency a great deal, it still is working against a current which is undermining the authority of the ultimate source of that valency. These were also coming under pressure from the increasing spread of social media exchange, because repetition depends on the control of media outlets. And the control of media outlets, if you compare the circulation of the Sunday Post and the Record, very much in print culture, in 1979 with 2014, the control of media outlets was a diluting asset, and in some ways, in some areas, a collapsing asset. Now, the thing about questions is, the way that they're such an effective substitute is that they are a valency farm. They grow valency all the time. Questions are actually the best way of growing authority in the absence of trust for authority, because they convey implicit authority in an era when explicit authority is doubted or disbelieved. Used in the right way, they withdraw ground from an opposing case as they construct the conditions in which they can be made impossible to answer satisfactorily. What will Scotland's economic growth rate be in 2019 if you're independent, for example? What will yours be? You're just answering me back. But even more genetically planted questions produce what can be called the quizmaster effect. Bamba Gascoigne, the late Magnus Magnusson, Jeremy Paxman, Anne Robinson, and many others have created over the years the illusion of an authority which tests the boundaries of omniscience by being in control of answers to questions they ask, which are in reality supplied to them by third parties. It's no coincidence either that in many reality television shows turn on intensive and interrogatory questioning. To ask the question is to occupy a position of power, and the quizmaster effect makes that power seem illusorily illimitable. Now, the universities were a great source of open political debate during the referendum campaign, and quite correctly retained the neutrality that enabled them to be so. The 5 million questions run from the University of Dundee was perhaps the most successful initiative of this kind. Chris Watley, who pioneered this, is an exceptional historian with some of the deepest and best primary research in the Scottish 18th century to be found anywhere, but we disagreed on the referendum, though not by as much as a casual onlooker might think. I think myself, though, that in the 5 million questions title, there's the faintest implication that the whole population of Scotland were demanding answers to questions about the future. Questions which needed to be answered, of course, because no answers had yet been provided by the SNP government. And how on earth does one answer 5 million questions anyway? Of course it was a rhetorical title, but rhetoric is always negotiating reality. That's what it's for. The Quizmaster route, with its habitual outside the universities, demand that answers be given to questions which could not be answered except by futurological speculation or certainty about the outcome of negotiations which had yet to take place, was unquestionably, if you'll pardon me, a fruitful one for Better Together. The statements made by politicians and the doubts of businessmen were losing the valency they once had had. Although among many voters there was a residual preference to trust Westminster over Holyrood political statements, helped by the kind of questioning from the mainstream media which drew suspicion regarding its neutrality, to put it no higher. Have you noticed how the television news is outside the House of Commons it's daylight and outside 10 Downing Street it's dark? There is nowhere else, you know. Nowhere else at all where politics happens. Nonetheless, the argument from authority was a wasting asset, so the questioning strategy became a powerful and necessary supplement to it. It was very successful. Plan B, what is Plan B on the currency? Well, which was in fact the question, suppose you lose the negotiations which the UK government, which you're certain to do, can you guarantee what you'll do by telling us the outcome in the event of your failure, which is already certain? But it was less successful once the social media offensive heralded in Pat Kane's speech got underway. Now, the rapidly evolving and changing nature of social media is proving difficult to predict in its effects for a wide range of more traditional stakeholders. This is hardly surprising given the compellingly rapid and global social penetration achieved by some of the main players in such a short time. Twitter had 288 million monthly active users, sending 500 million tweets a month in the fourth quartile of 2014. Facebook had 1.4 billion monthly active users, Instagram 300 million, and Snapchat at 100 million in August 2014. But those 100 million, far more than Twitter, those 100 million were sending 700 million photos a day, and 71% were under 25. And so I think the House of Lords might be recommending that they don't have a vote. But the point about it is that they are very strong demographics. They're very strong demographics here, and they're very strong user numbers. The activity numbers vary quite a bit. The activity numbers on Twitter, 500 million tweets a month for 288 million users, isn't that exciting. There are a lot of quasi-redundant, if not redundant, account or front accounts on Twitter, but the figures for Snapchat are very striking indeed. And of course, all this has come about in what's fundamentally a very short space of time, just over a decade. And of course, those are not the only mass providers. Now, none of the users of these groups are manageable demographics along the space-time axes of conventional political discourse. They are potentially very large groups, and they're always very fast. Their users, if not beyond the law, tend to get away with making statements which range from the tendentious to vile more than they would do in other media. And given the extent of human desire to think the best of other people, it is often the unpleasant that becomes the viral. But they have political immediacy and locality in a way that grey photographs of the local MSP holding a lamb rather uncertainly over a wisely chosen cheap suit in a muddy field in the local press can never obtain. Conversations can start about an event while that event is already taking place. And by the time speakers walk out of a townhouse meeting, it can already have been editorialized. It may have been editorialized and there's a large-scale comments column. No conventional media can be as fast unless they're doing the same thing virtually, unless they're streaming live. And of course, that can be done too and shared on multiple platforms. Wisely, David Brun at Glasgow and Chris Watley at Dundee, to go to my book, back to my book example, chose the YouTube route backed by print media tasters for the referendum debates. The download audience is bigger than for most books, which is no doubt linked to the reason that Coursera, the major provider of mass open online courses to higher education, has just reached an agreement with Instagram as the platform for the short specialist add-ons to its more general online provision. Even in conventional academic life, the indications are that online downloadable journals can have an exponential effect on readership. One example I was looking at in the US last year showed reader numbers rising from a dozen to thousands for individual articles online. Social media gave the Yes campaign an immediacy that the misuse of Disraeli's language in the context of 4 nations with 6 parties in government could never have. How did it change the means of persuasion? Well, first of all, there is the tacticality of it. Its very speed changes the ground which it occupies, and which its adversaries seek to occupy, with rapidity, and the recreation of contemporaneity in real time, especially in the case of Twitter. How can you anticipate an opponent's case when it's crowdsourced and changing from hour to hour, if not minute to minute? This is at the core of social media's power, that it destabilizes the inherited genetic nature of the rhetorical exchange. Anti-occupatio ultimately means that you've got to control a lot of the opening gambits in discourse. You get to speak first, as you can do, of course, if you're representing the status quo. Your opponent comes next. Then matters develop. But what happens if you just don't have that space-time continuum? It destabilizes rhetorical exchange and the ability that exchange has historically to anticipate, defend, and celebrate established positions. Print and early electronic media had already been undermining to an extent the classic conditions of such exchange and altering its terms, but social media is exploding them. In 1914 and later, the acceptance of the ethos of what happened or may have happened 2,300 years earlier, Thucydides' rhetorical recreation of Pericles' funeral oration over the Athenian dead, that the whole earth is the tomb of famous men. Not only are they commemorated by columns and inscriptions in their own country, but in foreign lands there dwells also an unwritten memorial of them, graven not on stone, but in the hearts of men. That statement, penned 2,300 years earlier, was unproblematic. The many post-war tombs of the unknown soldier manifest directly the hold of Pericles' funeral oration. In Toronto in 1924, in Auckland in 1929, and even in Bomber Command Memorial in Green Park, quotation or paraphrase from Thucydides' Pericles rhetoricizes the brutal reality of war. But in such a short time, hardly anybody thinks about war or believes that anymore in the general exchange of social media. The multiplicity of views and outlets in which the underlying facts are presented has, by its very exponential voicing of the issues, undermined the established positions on which such rhetoric relies. And this situation has only been intensified. I think perhaps one should go back to the electronic media age and to broadcast reporting in Vietnam for some of the key changes there, but the social media has certainly accelerated it, as it does all changes. It is also true that social media, without dwelling too much on the medium being the message, is strongly influenced by its own speed, especially where that is combined with physical restrictions which are a manifestation of that rapidity, and I'll come to that in a moment, most notably Twitter's 140-character limit. I'll now turn to look specifically at YouTube and Twitter because of the effect that the character limit that this character-limited discourse has on rhetorical approaches. Now, YouTube was heavily used in the referendum campaign as a social media rebuttal unit, with clips from the mainstream media presented in lightly editorialized form to demonstrate the lack of fair hearing that the Yes campaign believed it was receiving. And I think the classic example of that is the clips, and there's so many of them, from Channel 4 and from Newsnight, where Alex Salmond usually, but there are other candidates, gets talked over, talked down to, ignored, claimed that he hasn't answered questions when he has, and so forth. And there are a couple of them. Alex Salmon calmly overpowers Channel 4 presenters' barrage of questioning. YouTube 149,000 views. Alex Salmon versus Jeremy Paxman, 95,000 views. Paxman with Alex Salmon, certain depiction of the patronizing Englishman, 80,000 views. But it also provides a platform for some of the commentators who lie on the outside, or at the outside of the debate from the point of view of conventional reportage, but have got a great and international celebrity commentator following, and that, of course, one example of those is Noam Chomsky. So there's 125,000 views for Noam Chomsky on Scottish independence. Now, I'm not quite sure what Noam Chomsky's actual track record on understanding the constitutional developments in Scotland was until very recently. Nonetheless, that the brand, that's a very interesting example of positive valency continuing in social media, the brand of Chomsky is sufficient to garner that level of views. Now, there's also the key, not only the key rebuttal unit, but the non-reporting of bias, getting around the non-reporting of bias. And here I think the classic case is John Robertson at the University of West of Scotland's study on the BBC's reporting of the referendum and how it was biased. Now, the response to that was a classic opening of a free and fair debate without prejudice or favour, which was writing to the principal of the University of West of Scotland saying that the university and the BBC had been brought into disrepute by this research. That was very appropriate, and it saved reporting it. Obviously, the university took a positive view of John Robertson contributing to the debate. But it's very interesting that the bigger the lie is the YouTube tag. That John Robertson's short broadcast, largely without any excitement, jokes, or spirit of fun, standing on one leg, children falling off swings, or animals causing household accidents, has 102,000 views. Just a simple, straightforward, basic broadcast on the core of the research from John Robertson himself, with 10,000 media hits a day on his report. And I'm leaving out the very high Facebook trending figures and the pushing of this story to a wide range of other social media. That's very, very interesting, because that's an exact position of clash. This is a story which is not newsworthy, right? It's a story which is not newsworthy in the structures of conventional report, but it's only newsworthy in social media. And the more that situation is visible to a larger number of people, the more the valency of traditional print and electronic media will be eroded. Because if social media can create a mass audience for what's quite simply academic research, and I don't pretend, that academic research is exciting, obviously on the referendum it's very, very topical, then that academic research, which has not been reported, even though it's critical to the nature of the debate, then it's very clear that those who don't report it have some questions to answer in the minds of those viewing the YouTube video, now at 102,000. And I also didn't want to leave out, given the importance of sharing and downloading music files, the social media generation, this university's Zara Gladman's contribution as Lady Alba in Bad Romance, which has now reached around 134,000 views. Interestingly and classically, this song fulfills the canons of classical rhetorical delivery by establishing ethos: I want your weapons of mass destruction, I want student fees, before utilizing pathos to draw in the viewer. I'm sure that's how Zara thought of it. One of the interesting demonstrations of enduring valency was the fact that conventional media placement most likely to generate social media attention was on average an interview or website article on the BBC. And that goes back to my initial premise: the BBC actually enjoys stronger valency. It drives a lot of social media pickup, much more than other news sites do. And that social valency was one of the key issues that caused such irritation and annoyance in the campaign. But new media, of course, also sprang up in this realm. Bella Caledonia and Wings Over Scotland being only two of the better known. Bella, with its daily readership of 40,000 and 32,000 followers on this main Twitter account, has embedded Twitter feeds on site and a whole range of web action links, including 108 blog sites. Wings has 37,000 Twitter followers and now almost 370,000 posted comments, which simply shows the strength of engagement in these sites. If you can getting on for 500,000 comments on a site hosted in Bath, you're not doing badly in terms of exploring contemporary Scotland. Now, Twitter, of course, and I promised I'd come to Twitter, places specific rhetorical demands on persuasive communication. Its primary aims can include the unproblematic, first of all, the unproblematic case, good news, one piece of evidence or an image, sometimes not even supportive of good news. I've seen, and this is from all parties, strong turnout, hashtag G2015. It's attached to a photograph showing about 6 people by a stall on a Dreich day looking thoroughly visible and wishing they hadn't come out because nobody else had. Nonetheless, good news. And the same obviously goes, same goes ahead for all political parties there. But the aim really is statement momentum, which is driven forward by images and hashtags. And that goes for the shoe aid tweet. That was the story there was Angela Constance auctioning her shoes. Won't tell us all. That went endlessly round and round the system in Twitter. And it's statement momentum, the unproblematic case, the good news, the simple case, and statement momentum are two of the key features of the way Twitter rhetoricizes. There's the implicit target. There are enough explicit ones in trolling and so forth, but the implicit target is much more respectful. And I have to say, this has got nothing to do with Angela Constance, right? This is the third tweet. How much do you care about human beings? I really, really care. That's a bit far left for me, which is, of course, obviously an implicit criticism. And I'm not going to say who posted that, so, but it's an implicit criticism. So Twitter can be used even in a relatively short space of time to actually itself create its own anti-occupatio, the sense of people rhetoricizing, but the one's opponent rhetoricizing, but not really believing in these values. And of course, bad news. Dumfries and Galloway's Labour Council's plan to cut teacher numbers could lose region 1.57 million, with an appropriate hashtag to help drive it forward for station momentum. And of course, it helps when there's a number or a definitive statement of quote in negative statements like that. Often good turnout statements, though not always, good turnout statements can be more woolly. The rhetoric of Twitter is still developing, but its key elements are a definition used to avoid argument and driven by space, momentum, engagement, and very interestingly for, as it were, Twitter etiquette, selling, not boasting. And that selling, not boasting, apart from the definition momentum, engagement, selling, not boasting, is the balance, perfectly expressed in the medium, between personal valency, trust me because I'm really special, dead clever, right? And the medium, nobody gets more than 140 characters. So that actually, the way in which boasting on Twitter doesn't work beyond a certain point is it doesn't drive statement momentum because the medium is ultimately more democratic than a message which is purely about self-aggrandizement, personal self-aggrandizement, as opposed to good news. It's an interesting example of how the rhetorical environment helps to create the rhetorical conditions. So this is what Twitter can provide, but what does it make difficult? Well, it makes difficult one of the core premises of this lecture, anti-occupatio. How do you occupy the space that your opponent is going to occupy before either that opponent or that space is defined? How do you do that? Because it will be defined several times, redefined several times, at the point in which you think you've done it, and then it will be redefined again. And also remembering how far the businesses, the nature of the businesses behind these brands, because they are large and they are global and they are free, you are the product. Your data is the product. And insofar as your data is the product, do not expect too strong a cooperation between social media corporates and their competitors in government. So, because the government wants your data and social media wants your data, but they want to be able to get hold of your data. They really, really, really do. And controlling the circulation and the statement momentum is not a good way of getting hold and keeping hold of the data of a large number of people. Whether or not you're in the thick of it, the use of personal data to control the terms of debate and to facilitate them are differing strategies with clearly different appeals to the individual user. While the tipping point in the use of social media in debate may not have been achieved in 2013-14, that time is very likely to come, especially if the mainstream media finds unconditional support for UK government positions progressively more difficult. We await an in-out European referendum with interest, though with trepidation. In the meantime, I really once again invite you to explore hashtag Ask Nigel Farage for, I particularly like the one with my partner is a sprinter and I'm a hurdler, and it's a mixed marriage, which one of us will have to go home. Perhaps a veiled allusion there to the beer and cigarettes, who knows. But the way in which that kind of positioning reflects a space which, incidentally, as I argued earlier, perhaps the mainstream media are vacating. Can they keep on vacating it? We shall see. So we await that next referendum, if it is a European referendum, with interest, though with trepidation, not least here in Scotland, where other debates continue. Thank you very much.